Imagine a dinner that was supposed to be just another business engagement, but turns into a life-changing event for two people. Now, add an unexpected guest, someone society would never expect in such an environment. Sounds like an unlikely story, right? But the truth is, the most moving stories, the ones that truly touch our hearts, often arise in the most unexpected moments. And this moving story, a true tale of overcoming and transformation, is no exception. This is the kind of story that makes us question what truly matters in life. It's about a businessman, accustomed to luxurious dinners and circles of power, and his housekeeper, a simple woman but full of wisdom. They come from completely different worlds, but find themselves in a moment that will forever change their perspectives. The story is as real as it is inspiring, filled with emotions that compel us to reflect on our own choices and priorities. But why is this story so powerful? Because it challenges beliefs, touches on wounds we often ignore, and shows us that the most valuable lessons in life often come from where we least expect them. Who would have thought that a simple gesture, like an unexpected invitation, could be the starting point for one of the most impactful moving stories you'll ever hear? It's a story with a moral, a true life story that teaches us the value of humility, empathy, and the ability to see beyond appearances. If you've ever felt stuck in a routine, disconnected from something greater, or simply curious about how life can surprise us, then this story is for you. Get ready for a narrative that blends raw emotions, moments of transformation, and a connection as improbable as it is powerful. Because in the end, it's in real stories that we find the deepest truths. And this, without a doubt, is one of the most moving stories the world needs to hear. Imagine a man who, in the eyes of the world, seemed to have it all: a successful career, an impeccable mansion, and the respect of his peers. Yet behind the scenes, this middle-aged businessman was dealing with the wreckage of a recent divorce. The separation left him with more than just an empty house. It stripped away the emotional stability that fueled his determination. Amid contracts and meetings, he found himself immersed in overwhelming loneliness. The nights were filled with the echo of solitary footsteps in wide hallways, where laughter and future plans once resounded. It's intriguing how the lack of human connection can weigh more heavily than any professional responsibility. Amid this desolate backdrop, she emerged, the housekeeper who kept the home spotless while carrying a burden of challenges her employer knew nothing about. A middle-aged woman with a serene smile and admirable patience, she concealed a life full of battles. Despite her simplicity, her wisdom extended far beyond any academic degree. Behind the modest uniform was someone who faced each day with quiet strength, a true inspiration camouflaged by routine. It's curious to think that while some have everything and feel they lack something, others, with so little, exude an unmatched richness of spirit. Their relationship, however, was strictly professional. He saw her as a necessary cog in the machine that kept his life running. She viewed him as a distant but fair employer. There was respect, of course, but also an invisible barrier created by differences in status and life experiences. They rarely exchanged words beyond daily instructions and formal greetings. But as they say, fate has strange ways of breaking down barriers. And that's exactly what began to unfold in that seemingly ordinary house, brimming with untold stories. The businessman's routine was predictable: endless meetings, dinners with important clients, and the uncomfortable silence of returning home. He believed life was a game of strategy, where emotions were mere accessories and human connections disposable details. However, reality was about to show him that sometimes the unexpected is the only catalyst for true change. It's curious how small decisions can trigger events of unimaginable proportions, like a simple gesture of seeing someone in a new light. Meanwhile, the housekeeper carried on with her routine almost mechanically, but with an observant eye that captured nuances of her employer's personality he himself ignored. She could recognize the loneliness masked behind professional smiles. After all, who better than someone living in simplicity to perceive the complexities of the human heart? It was as if, even in silence, she knew more about him than he would ever admit aloud. The truth is, they were both at emotional crossroads, albeit on completely different paths. There was something fascinating about how chance seemed to orchestrate encounters no one plans, but that somehow are necessary. The businessman, lost in his bubble of work and frustration, hardly noticed the presence of this woman who, day after day, did more than just clean his house. She maintained order amidst chaos, and she, in turn, would never have imagined that her seemingly unreachable employer would need her for something beyond a tidy home. It was as if they were pieces of a puzzle that fate was beginning to assemble. And then, a specific moment came to break the monotony of their static relationship. An unforeseen need began to emerge on the horizon, something that would place them in the same setting in an unexpected way. The businessman, so used to controlling every detail of his life, was about to make a choice completely off-script. The housekeeper, on the other hand, would have to decide if she was ready to step out of the anonymity she had always preferred. But as we will see, life has a peculiar way of pushing us out of our comfort zones. It was an afternoon like any other at the office, but something began to shift in the meticulously organized life of the businessman. An important business dinner was scheduled, an event that could open doors to valuable partnerships. However, the unexpected happened. The assistant who always accompanied him called at the last minute, saying he couldn't attend. With no obvious alternative and pressed for time, he began to consider the impossible. Among a list of contacts and the weight of silence in his home, his eyes fell on the housekeeper organizing documents in the living room. The idea seemed absurd, but at that moment of urgency, it was the only one that made sense. When he finally called her to discuss the matter, she was stunned. An invitation to a business dinner? Her first reaction was to withdraw. After all, how could someone like her fit into such a sophisticated and formal setting? But at the same time, there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes, a sense that this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It was as if life, for the first time in a long while, was inviting her to something beyond the repetitive daily grind. Still, her hands trembled as she pondered whether to accept or decline. On the other side of the situation, the businessman also felt uncomfortable. He wasn't used to blending the well-segregated worlds of his personal and professional life. But there was something he couldn't deny. An inexplicable curiosity had led him to extend that invitation. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to handle every household challenge with serenity, or perhaps it was the loneliness driving him to seek a human connection, even in such an unconventional way. He explained the situation quickly, as if fearing she would change her mind before even responding. The housekeeper, after overcoming the initial shock, began to weigh the pros and cons. She knew it wasn't just a dinner. It was an opportunity to see the world from a different perspective. But there was also the fear of being judged, of not being good enough. What if I say something wrong? What if I seem out of place? These questions haunted her, but she remembered how she had faced greater challenges in life. After all, she had overcome financial crises, family losses, and so many other situations that tested her strength. Why not try something new now? Meanwhile, the businessman noticed her hesitation and, for the first time, felt compelled to reassure her. He mentioned that he wasn't expecting perfection, just her presence. This gesture, simple yet sincere, made her reconsider. Often people don't need grand speeches, just a little encouragement to take the next step. She finally accepted, still insecure but with a glimmer of hope that this experience could bring something meaningful. After she agreed, he began to realize the peculiarity of his choice. It was a risk, no doubt, but also a chance to break the monotony of his corporate dinners. He reflected on how often the people around him seemed more interested in impressing him than understanding him. Perhaps, without realizing it, he was seeking something more authentic. It was fascinating how, even in the most improbable circumstances, the universe seemed to conspire to make us look beyond the obvious. As they both mentally prepared for that unexpected evening, a subtle change began to take place. She, still in shock, thought about how she could ensure she wouldn't embarrass him. He, on the other hand, wondered how she would react to a world so far removed from what she was used to. It was the beginning of something neither of them could predict. And as we know, it's in the most unusual moments that the most memorable stories begin to unfold. The invitation was made, and the housekeeper's acceptance was just the beginning of a night that promised to be unforgettable. That afternoon, While the businessman finished his tasks at the office, she was at home, facing the challenge of preparing for an environment entirely out of her reality. Her first thought was, "I have nothing suitable to wear." Among simple and practical clothes, there was nothing that made her feel ready for the occasion. But as always in her life, she decided to improvise with what she had, showing that sometimes elegance lies more in attitude than in wardrobe. As she searched for a forgotten dress in the back of the closet, the businessman driving home began reflecting on the decision he had made. He wasn't one to act impulsively, especially regarding something as important as a business dinner. But there was something about this situation that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the opportunity to see a side of life he had ignored for so long. Perhaps it was her simplicity, which contrasted so much with the artificiality of the circles he frequented. Whatever the reason, he realized that it was no longer just a strategic choice. It had become a personal experiment. Meanwhile, the housekeeper tried on the dress, fixed her hair, and looked at herself in the mirror with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. It wasn't just about her appearance, it was about how she felt in such a different role. "Will they accept me?" she wondered, as she adjusted a simple but elegant scarf on her shoulders. With each small detail, something inside her began to shift. It wasn't just external preparation, it was also an internal transformation, a newfound confidence she didn't know she had. It almost felt like she was living her own moving story. The businessman arrived home and, for the first time in years, felt nervous. He didn't know what to expect or how to react upon seeing his housekeeper in this completely new context. When she appeared in the living room, ready for the dinner, he was momentarily speechless. It wasn't just because of her appearance, although she looked very elegant, but because of the way she carried a quiet dignity he had never noticed before. At that moment, he realized that this night would be more than just a business meeting. It would be a moving, real story in his own life. She too noticed the change in the atmosphere. The businessman's gaze was no longer that of an employer to an employee. It was of someone beginning to see beyond appearances. It was a brief but powerful moment that broke part of the invisible barrier that had always existed between them. "Ready?" he asked with a subtle smile, and she nodded, still nervous, but with a spark of determination in her eyes. It was as if both were about to embark on a journey they hadn't planned, but which now seemed inevitable. The drive to the restaurant was marked by a silence full of meaning. Both had much on their minds, but few words to share. He, accustomed to luxurious dinners, began to wonder how she would handle that environment. She, in turn, tried to imagine what awaited her, battling the fear of the unknown. At some point, he broke the silence with an unexpected phrase, "You'll do great. Trust me." It was a small gesture, but carried enormous weight. For the first time, she felt that he genuinely believed in her. When they arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere was already set for something extraordinary. Dim lights, soft music, and tables filled with important people created an almost intimidating environment. He held the door open for her, and together they crossed the threshold into a night that, unbeknownst to them, would change the course of their stories. The dinner had yet to begin, but it was already clear that the moment would be more than just a meeting. It would be the start of a moving story they would never forget. As they entered the restaurant, the businessman felt the weight of curious and judgmental gazes. It was a luxurious environment where every detail seemed designed to impress. Soft lighting illuminated elegantly decorated tables, and the murmurs of sophisticated conversations filled the space. For him, this was just another night among many, but for his housekeeper, it was like stepping into a new world. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail with a mix of fascination and discomfort. Yet she kept her posture upright and her gaze steady, as if reminding herself that she belonged there, even if no one believed it. The dinner guests quickly noticed the unusual presence beside the businessman. Discreet whispers arose, and some faces showed surprise and disapproval. "Who is she? What is he thinking?" These unspoken questions were evident in their expressions. However, there was also a quiet curiosity in some gazes, as if this unexpected situation had broken the monotony of predictable events. The housekeeper noticed the looks, but didn't let them show how they affected her. Her wisdom told her that people always judge what they don't understand. When they sat down, the businessman made sure to introduce her, though without revealing too much about who she really was. He called her "my special guest," a choice of words that intrigued many of those present. This generated a mix of respect and speculation as everyone tried to place her in a context that made sense. Meanwhile, the housekeeper absorbed the situation, reminding herself that the most important thing wasn't how they saw her, but how she saw herself. It was a moment of silent learning, a true chapter of a life story she would never forget. As the dinner progressed, conversations at the table began to flow. Initially reserved, the housekeeper gradually gained confidence. It didn't take long for her simplicity and natural wisdom to catch the attention of those around her. When asked about something trivial, she responded with such genuine honesty that it drew smiles from some and reflections from others. It was fascinating how, amidst so many rehearsed speeches and polished phrases, her words brought an unexpected freshness. A story about her childhood told casually became one of the most talked-about moments of the night. The businessman, on the other hand, began to see something he had never noticed before. While other guests tried to impress him with titles and accomplishments, she, with no pretense, managed to captivate everyone's attention with her authenticity. He realized that success isn't always in appearances or status, but in the ability to connect genuinely with people. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing the world with new eyes, leading him to question many of his choices and priorities. A particularly memorable moment occurred when an important client made an ironic comment about simplicity. The housekeeper, with calm and a slight smile, responded, "Sometimes the simplest things teach us the greatest lessons." The room fell silent for a few seconds, and even the businessman was impressed by the depth of her response. From that point on, the way people looked at her changed. She was no longer just an unusual guest. She had become someone who had something valuable to offer, a perspective that challenged the materialism and selfishness predominant in the environment. As the evening progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The curious glances turned into gestures of respect, and even a few genuine questions were directed at the housekeeper. It was evident that she was subtly but powerfully shifting the dynamic of the dinner. The businessman, observing all of this, felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: pride, not for what he had achieved, but for making the decision to bring someone who, in such a short time, had touched so many lives. The dinner wasn't over yet, but the story was already being written in a natural and remarkable way that no one would leave unchanged. As the dinner continued, the conversation between the businessman and his housekeeper began to flow more naturally. It wasn't planned, but the words seemed to find the right moments to emerge. He, who always considered himself a good strategist in business, realized he had a significant gap when it came to human relationships. As he looked at his housekeeper, he noticed details he had previously ignored. The gaze that seemed to carry centuries of wisdom, the serene yet firm tone of her voice, and the way she carefully chose each word. It was as if she were a living story, a moving story waiting to be told. She, in turn, began to share fragments of her life, something she had never done before. She talked about the challenges of raising 2 children as a single mother, how she had to abandon her own dreams to support her family, and how, even in adversity, she found strength in faith and simplicity. Every word she spoke was filled with emotion, but also with a strength that left the businessman deep in thought. He, who had always believed that success equated to financial stability, began to see that the greatest achievements often lay in resilience in the face of difficulties. The moment that struck him the most was when she told a story about a Christmas when she couldn't afford gifts for her children. Instead of despairing, she decided to create a family tradition. They spent the night singing, cooking together, and giving thanks for what they had. She described how it became the most special moment of their lives, something no gift could replace. He remained silent for a moment, absorbing the depth of that moving story. How could someone so simple teach something so profound? The businessman also began to open up, albeit more hesitantly. For the first time, he shared the emptiness he had felt since his divorce, about how life had become a series of commitments with no real meaning. He admitted that even surrounded by luxury and power, he felt disconnected from something greater, The housekeeper listened attentively, without judgment, simply absorbing every word. When he finished, she said something that would stay with him forever. "Sometimes what we lack isn't what we have, but who we are." It was a simple phrase, but loaded with a truth he had never considered. The conversation continued, and the businessman began to realize how much he had neglected the essence of the people around him. How many times had he ignored the stories behind appearances? How many valuable lessons had he missed because he was too busy chasing the next big deal? This realization led him to deep introspection. He felt ashamed, but also grateful for being there at that moment, having the opportunity to see everything with new eyes. It was as if suddenly his life was a story in need of a new plot. As the evening progressed, the two realized they were building something special. It wasn't just an exchange of words, it was an exchange of worlds and perspectives. The housekeeper, who once seemed so distant from his universe, had become someone he deeply respected, and she, who had always seen him as a distant employer, began to see the humanity behind the facade. It was fascinating how a simple conversation could transform an entire relationship. It was indeed a moving story they would both live to tell. The businessman found himself reflecting on how that dinner, which began as a strategic necessity, had turned into something much deeper. It was as if a door had been opened to a new understanding of life, of people, and of himself. There was still much to be said, much to be explored, but he knew that night had already planted important seeds. What he didn't yet realize was that the most transformative event of the evening was yet to occur. Continuing with the translation, the dinner seemed to proceed smoothly, but as in every great story, there is always a turning point. During a tense conversation involving an important client and a delicate negotiation, the unexpected happened. The businessman, accustomed to controlling every detail of his interactions, saw the situation slip out of his hands. The client, dissatisfied with the terms being discussed, began to show visible discontent. The atmosphere grew tense, and everyone around the table felt the impact. At that moment, the housekeeper, who had remained more reserved until then, did something no one expected. With impressive calm, she intervened subtly but effectively. "Forgive me for stepping in, but sometimes, instead of seeking what we want, it's wiser to understand what we truly need," she said, looking directly at the client. Her voice was serene but full of conviction. That simple yet profound statement made the client pause for a moment. She continued with a real story about how she once had to negotiate something important for her family and learned that listening to the other side is often more valuable than imposing her own conditions. The client, surprised by her approach, began to reconsider his position. The businessman watched the scene in shock, but also with admiration. Never in his career had he seen someone act so naturally in such a delicate situation. The most impressive part was that she had no formal training in business, just the practical wisdom gained from her life experiences. That intervention completely changed the tone of the discussion. The client, who had seemed immovable, started to open up. It was as if her words had dismantled an invisible barrier, allowing the negotiation to take a more positive turn. After the conversation, the client made an unexpected comment. "If I had half the clarity of this lady, my decisions would be much easier." It was a sincere compliment that drew smiles from everyone at the table, including the businessman. He knew that this night would be remembered for a long time, not just for the successful negotiation, but for the unusual way everything unfolded. It was evident that her presence had brought a new kind of energy to the environment, something he had never experienced before at his formal dinners. But the transformation didn't stop there. As the night progressed, other guests began interacting with her, curious about her perspective on the world. She shared more stories from her life, each one more inspiring than the last, creating a genuine connection with people who might never have noticed her otherwise. It was a practical lesson in empathy and authenticity, something the businessman began to recognize as the true value of human interaction. He realized that, throughout his career, he had surrounded himself with people who only told him what he wanted to hear, but here was someone who spoke the truth he needed to hear. The night ended with an unexpected gesture from the client, who had nearly walked away from the negotiation. He personally thanked the housekeeper, Saying her words had made him reflect not only on the business deal, but also on his own life. For the businessman, this was a turning point. He began questioning not just his professional choices, but also his personal priorities. How could he have spent so much time chasing success while ignoring the value of the people around him? It was a question that would linger with him for a long time. On the drive home, the car was filled with a meaningful silence. The businessman, still processing everything that had happened, felt a profound respect for the woman beside him. She, on the other hand, was exhausted, but had a lightness in her heart. Both of them knew that night had changed something in their lives, even if they didn't yet know exactly what. But as with all great moving stories, the real impact would only be understood with time. And unknowingly, the growing connection between them was about to transform not just their lives, but also how they saw the world around them. The morning after the dinner, the businessman woke up with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He found himself thinking about the previous night, how a situation that began as a logistical inconvenience had turned into something so profound. Remembering the words and actions of his housekeeper, he realized it wasn't just about her or the client. It was about himself, about how he had neglected the essence of human connections. For the first time in a long time, he felt his life needed a change, not in his business but in how he lived. The housekeeper, meanwhile, returned to work as she always did, but something about her had changed. It wasn't something she expressed in words, but it was present in her gestures and the sparkle in her eyes. The previous night had been more than a unique experience. It was a reaffirmation of her dignity and her ability to positively impact the world around her. Even as she cleaned the house, she now did so with a renewed sense of purpose, as though every small action had a larger meaning. That dinner had ignited a spark in her she hadn't known existed. For the businessman, the lessons from that night began to manifest in his daily decisions. He started paying more attention to the people around him, from his colleagues at the office to the employees who handled the smallest details of his life. A casual conversation with the receptionist, a genuine thank you to the driver. Small gestures that once seemed insignificant now carried new meaning. It was a constant reminder that every person carries a unique story, a moving story, that can teach us something valuable if we're willing to listen. The relationship between him and the housekeeper also changed. It was no longer just an employer-employee dynamic. There was a mutual respect that transcended social and professional boundaries. He began talking to her more, not just about daily tasks, but about life. He asked about her children, sought her opinions on small dilemmas, like which color to choose for the new curtains in the living room. For many, these gestures might seem trivial, but for her, they represented recognition, something she had long missed in her life. At the office, the businessman's colleagues noticed something different about him. He was more approachable, more human. During a meeting, for the first time, he shared an idea that wasn't just about profit, but about social impact. Inspired by the simplicity and depth of his housekeeper, he began thinking of ways to use his influence to make a difference. It was as if, somehow, he had rediscovered a part of himself that had been dormant. And it all began with what seemed like a trivial decision, inviting his housekeeper to a dinner. The housekeeper, too, began to notice changes in her life outside of work. Inspired by the confidence she had gained that night, she finally decided to enroll in a cooking course, something she had always wanted to do but had postponed out of insecurity. Gradually, she felt more confident in facing the world, knowing that her voice had value and that her story could inspire others. It wasn't just about what she said or did, but about who she was, a strong woman with a life story that could be one of the most moving stories many people would ever hear. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that night lingered. The businessman and the housekeeper didn't just change each other, they began to influence the people around them in ways they had never imagined. And as they continued with their lives, both knew that the dinner was more than just a business meeting. It was the beginning of a transformation that only real, emotional stories could provide. But there was still more to come, as life always finds ways to surprise us, especially when we're open to the lessons it offers. Sometimes life presents us with moments that seem ordinary, but carry the potential to change everything. That's exactly what the dinner represented for the businessman and his housekeeper, a turning point, an opportunity to look inward and see the world around them in an entirely new way. The lesson was clear. The most emotional stories aren't just the ones we read in books or watch in movies. They're the moving stories we live in our daily lives when we choose to open our eyes to the people and lessons they carry within them. For the businessman, the night brought the realization that true success isn't about accumulating material possessions or achieving prestigious positions. It's about building genuine connections. He discovered that behind every face is a story waiting to be told, a story that can change our perspective. In the case of the housekeeper, the transformation was equally powerful. She realized that even in her simplicity, she had the power to impact lives and inspire others with her resilience and wisdom. It was an exchange of worlds that revealed one of the oldest and most valuable lessons. Never underestimate the strength of a true life story. This encounter also reminds us of the value of humility and empathy. In a world where appearances often dictate judgments, the ability to look beyond the surface can mean the difference between a life filled with real connections or an isolated existence. The story of the businessman and his housekeeper is a clear example of how social barriers can be overcome when we choose to listen, understand, and value one another. Each of us carries a unique story, and when these stories are shared, they have the power to transform us in unimaginable ways. Perhaps the most striking part is how small gestures can trigger great changes. The simple act of inviting his housekeeper to dinner, something that initially seemed insignificant, set off a chain of events that profoundly impacted both of their lives. It makes us reflect. How often do we refrain from acting out of fear or convenience, missing opportunities to create moments that could become the moving stories of our own lives? Sometimes it takes courage to step out of our comfort zones and open the doors to the unexpected. The dinner was more than a remarkable night, it was a metaphor for life. The choices we make, no matter how small, shape our stories. The businessman learned the importance of cultivating authentic relationships, while the housekeeper discovered the value of her own voice. Together, they proved that mutual respect and the exchange of experiences are the foundations for any true transformation. This story, so simple in its essence, became one of the most moving stories they could share with the world. And for us, as we follow this narrative, the lesson is clear. We must be attentive to the opportunities to grow and learn from the people around us. It doesn't matter your social position, profession, or achievements. Every person carries something valuable within them. When we choose to look beyond appearances and connect with the real stories of those around us, we open the door to becoming better versions of ourselves. After all, it's in the most authentic stories that we find the deepest lessons. The night may have ended, but the changes it brought will continue to resonate in the lives of the businessman, the housekeeper, and everyone around them. It was proof that real and emotional stories have the power to create lasting transformations. And just like them, we can all live our own stories of overcoming, love, and inspiration, as long as we're willing to listen, learn, and grow. Now the cycle of life continues, ready to offer new encounters and new moving stories yet to be told. And now take a moment and think. How often do we fail to see the people around us? How many inspiring stories, filled with valuable lessons, go unnoticed because we're focused only on what's visible? This moving story reminds us that human connections are what truly give life meaning. So what are you doing to create your own real and emotional stories? True transformation begins when we decide to step out of our bubble and look at the world with empathy and curiosity. Ask yourself, what stories could you discover by paying attention to details you previously ignored? How could you transform someone's life, or your own, simply by listening and acting with humanity? Perhaps it's time for you to live your own moving story, one that could someday inspire others to do the same. So why not start today? Reflect on your choices, reconnect with the people around you, and make room for the unexpected in your life. And before you go, don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you'll continue learning and being inspired by real and emotional stories like this one. Because in the end, every story has the power to change a life, and perhaps the next one will be yours.